Chapter 5 Stalinism Revisited, or How Stalin Saved the Humanity of Man. The Stalinist Cultural Counter-Revolution. A consistent conservative case can be made that, far from being the greatest catastrophe that could have befallen Russia, Stalinism effectively saved what we understand as the humanity of man. Crucial here is the great shift of the early and mid-1930s from proletarian egalitarianism to the full assertion of the Russian legacy. In the cultural sphere, figures such as Pushkin and Tchaikovsky were elevated far above modernism. Traditional aesthetic norms of beauty were reasserted, homosexuality was outlawed, sexual promiscuity condemned, and marriage proclaimed the elementary cell of the new society. It was the end of the brief marriage of convenience between Soviet power and the artistic and scientific modernists. In cinema, this passage is clearly discernible in the shift from Eisenstein's silent films with their montage of attractions to his organicist sound films. In music, in the shift from Shostakovich's violent, parodic, provocative music with elements of circus and jazz from the 1920s to his return to more traditional forms in the late 1930s. The standard reading of this shift sees it as the cultural thermidor, the betrayal of the authentic revolution. However, before accepting this judgment at face value, one should take a closer look at the ideological vision which sustained radical egalitarianism. We refer here again to so-called biocosmism. A good example here is the following passage by Trotsky. What is a man? He is by no means a finished or harmonious being. No, he is still a highly awkward creature. Man, as an animal, has not evolved by plan, but spontaneously, and has accumulated many contradictions. The question of how to educate and regulate, of how to improve and complete the physical and spiritual construction of man, is a colossal problem which can only be understood on the basis of socialism. To produce a new, improved version of man, that is the future task of communism. And for that, we have first to find out everything about man, his anatomy, his physiology, and that part of his physiology which is called his psychology. Man must look at himself and see himself as a raw material, or at best, as a semi-manufactured product, and say, "At last, my dear Homo sapiens, I will work on you." These were not just idiosyncratic theoretical principles, but expressions of a real mass movement in art, architecture, psychology, pedagogy, and organizational sciences, comprising hundreds of thousands of people. The officially supported cult of Taylorism, whose most radical exponent was Alexei Gastev, a Bolshevik engineer and poet who used the term biomechanics as early as 1922, explored the vision of society in which man and machine would merge. Gastev ran the Institute of Labor, which carried out experiments to train workers to act like machines. He saw the mechanization of man as the next step in evolution, envisaging a utopia where people would be replaced by proletarian units, identified by ciphers such as ABC or 325, 0750, and so on. A mechanized collectivism would take the place of the individual personality in the psychology of the proletariat. There would no longer be a need for emotions, and the human soul would no longer be measured by a shout or a smile, but by a pressure gauge or a speedometer. Is not this dream the first radical formulation of what today one usually calls biopolitics? Counterintuitive as this may sound, one can argue that this vision, had it really been imposed, would have been much more terrifying than Stalinism actually was. It was against this threat of full-scale modernist mechanization that Stalinist cultural politics reacted. It not only demanded a return to artistic forms that would be attractive to large crowds, but also, although it may appear cynical, the return to elementary traditional forms of morality. In the Stalinist show trials, the victims were held responsible for certain acts, forced to confess. In short, though it may appear a scene, and it was, they were treated as autonomous ethical subjects, not as objects of biopolitics. Against the utopia of mechanized collectivism, high Stalinism of the 1930s stood for the return of ethics at its most violent, as an extreme measure to counteract the threat that traditional moral categories would be rendered meaningless, where unacceptable behavior would not be perceived as involving the subject's guilt, but as a malfunctioning measured by a social pressure gauge or a speedometer. This is also why the imposition of socialist realism was sincerely welcomed by a large majority of people. It signaled that the regime had completely abandoned its commitment to the revolutionary idea of establishing a proletarian or Soviet form of culture that could be distinguished from the culture of the past. Contemporary writers like Akhmatova could not find a publisher, but the complete works of Pushkin and Turgenev, Chekhov and Tolstoy, although not Dostoevsky, were issued in their millions as a new readership was introduced to them. This return to classical culture reached its peak in 1937, the centenary of Pushkin's death, when the whole country was involved in festivities. Small provincial theatres put on plays, schools organized special celebrations. Young communists went on pilgrimages to places connected with the poet's life. Factories organized study groups and clubs of Pushkinists. Collective farms held Pushkin carnivals with figures dressed as characters from Pushkin's fairy tales. These facts are worth mentioning because they bring us to another paradox. How the very resistance to Stalinism, marginal and oppressed as it was, followed this cultural trend. That is to say, although hypocritical and censored, this massive reintroduction of the classical Russian cultural heritage was more than just a measure for enlightening the half-illiterate masses. The universe of great classics such as Pushkin and Tolstoy contained an entire vision of culture, with its own ethics of social responsibility, of solidarity with the oppressed against autocratic power. Dissidents in the USSR represented truthfulness, unexpurgated reality, and ethical values, as against the fantasy reality of socialist realism and the pervasive falseness of Soviet public discourse, with its concerted negation of traditional morality, an explicitly stated, indeed fundamental, ingredient in the Soviet regime's forwarding of revolutionary development. In this sense, Solzhenitsyn himself is the son of the Stalinist cultural politics of the 1930s. This is also why the private works of Shostakovich, full of melancholy, despair, and private anxieties, centered on his string quartets, are no less an organic part of the Stalinist culture than his great public works, centered in his officially celebrated symphonies, 5, 7, and 11. And this brings us to the third paradox. Wilhelm Furtwängler's remarked apropos Stravinsky's Rite of Spring that it shows the limitation of Russian spirituality. It exults in brilliant mechanic, rhythmic explosions, but it cannot reach the level of organic living unity that characterizes German spirituality. The first irony is that the very same composers to which Furtwängler referred were perceived by the Russian traditionalists as Western modernizers endangering the Russian organic heritage. However, in a way, Furtwängler was right. Many Western travelers to Russia in the 18th and 19th centuries went there in search of an organic society, a living social whole, as opposed to Western individualist societies which were held together by the external pressure of laws. They soon discovered that Russia was actually a vast, chaotic empire, lacking precisely any inner organic form, and therefore ruled by the iron hand of the brutal imperial autocracy. In other words, the notion of old Russia, whose harmonious balance was disturbed by Western modernization, was mythical. Violent modernism, the brutal imposition of a central order onto the chaotic texture of social life, is thus a key component of traditional Russian social identity. Stalin was correct to celebrate Ivan the Terrible as his precursor. Is then the conclusion of this that, with regret, one should endorse Stalinism as the defense against a much worse threat? What about applying here to Lacan's motto, le pire ou le pire, and take the risk of the choice of the worst? What if the effective result of choosing to pursue to the end the biopolitical dream would have been something unpredictable that would have shaken the very coordinates of this dream?